Thanks for tuning in to PodCatalyst, the official podcast of IABC. Today's conversation is hosted by IABC Executive Director Peter Finn, featuring our guest Shane Hatton, author, speaker, and global expert in leadership and team culture. We'll be seeing Shane this year at World Conference in Vancouver, which takes place June 8th through the 11th. He's presenting a masterclass on culture as a competitive advantage, as well as a session called Gen Z Uncensored. If you want to learn more about our World Conference coming up this summer, you can visit wc.iabc.com. Today's episode between Peter and Shane really focuses on that central role the communicators play in stewarding an organization's culture. They take a moment to really dig into some of the hottest topics and headlines that we're seeing today that really do impact the communicator, whether that's the discussion around maintaining trust between employer and employee, conversations about returning to work, DEI policies and inclusion in the workplace. We're just simply navigating those generational differences now that we really do have 5 generations in the workplace. It was really great sitting in on this conversation, hearing what Shane had to say, and getting a sneak peek at some of the things he'll be sharing with us at World Conference. So thanks again to Shane for joining us, and let's get started with the show.
Hi, my name's Shane Hatton. I'm a speaker and author on organizational and team culture. And I think communication connects and strengthens teams together at the most fundamental level.
Shane, it is so good to see you. I know we met in London at the IABC event, which was really cool, and I got to see you speak, and it was awesome. And I'm glad that you're going to be speaking at World Conference in Vancouver, and yeah, looking forward to seeing you there. And I'm going to try to sit in on your masterclass. I was able to. I know you gave me a signed copy of your book, and I was able to read a little bit of that. So I have a few questions about workplace culture, but I think some other things we'll get into. I guess, right off the bat, what are some assumptions people make about workplace culture that you want to challenge?
Yeah, great question. I mean, first and foremost, thanks for having me. You also have an incredible podcasting voice. I feel like this is a great thing for us. So it must be very easy for people to listen to. Yeah. And so in case people haven't noticed, I am Australian made. So Apologies if I say anything in Australian that doesn't make a lot of sense to anyone else outside of the areas that might be listening to that. Culture, big conversation, big topic. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made around that. I did a research project when I was in the process of writing Let's Talk Culture, and I asked a lot of questions about culture, and I learned a lot of what I thought were very basic assumptions about culture that people held very different views on. The first one, I think probably one of the biggest ones that I've latched onto in the last few years, is that in our research, about 50% of managers told us that culture is not something that can be influenced, that it just happens. And that was confronting for me because I don't know about you, but that feels I would feel very powerless if I believed that culture was just the sum product of everything that we were doing, that we couldn't change it, we couldn't alter it, that we just had to deal with the culture that we had. And so I spent a lot of my time working with organizations to challenge that assumption that just because you have a culture doesn't mean you can't change that culture into something more aligned with what you would like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just so folks that maybe don't know, about your background, when you work with companies or organizations, I'm sure it's a variety of institutions, but is it HR folks, communications? Who are the folks that you consult with?
It's so funny. I feel like I sit as this connector between HR and communication professionals, because a lot of people would say, well, culture is the responsibility of HR, and HR constantly saying, well, I want everybody to feel like they own culture. And then what I think I bring to this space, and I think is so central to this, is that communication plays such an integral role in shaping organizational culture. And I've often used the phrase that if culture is like this kind of orchestra where we get this sheet music we get to play to, we have everybody singing on the same page, I feel like communication professionals are the conductors or the songwriters that can write this incredible music so that everyone can play along to, and often are overlooked and excluded from the culture process. And so I'm doing my best to bring them back into that conversation.
And do you think that the role of the communication professional is, there's been greater reliance on the field, those roles within organizations over the last couple of years?
I think There was a phrase that I don't like to use, but I'm hearing it more often than not now, is people saying, for years they were saying, I want a seat at the table. And it was this constant conversation, I want a seat at the table. And I feel in recent years, people have got more of a seat and more influence at the table than they ever have before. And I think COVID helped a lot with that, because everyone started to realize, oh my gosh, we've mobilized a workforce. Communication is now central to what we do. And now the conversation is, well, what do we do with the influence and the platform and the seat at the table that we do have?
Yeah. Because, I was just thinking also about, the hybrid workforce. And some are going back to more in office, but, the role of communications, and that shift. And, is that, and sort of maintaining culture when you have folks that are either fully remote or maybe in the office 1 or 2 days a week.
Well, I think this is one of the big pieces that I think is overlooked in the culture conversation. And again, it comes back to some of the assumptions that people make. I think a lot of people make the assumption that culture is just about our behaviors or our values, which is if it is about that, then it's probably about taking your team off site on a day, creating values, creating behaviors, and then letting it run. Whereas I think what is so central to the culture conversation is communication. How does this play out every single day in our language? I often say that culture is leaking when your leaders are speaking. You can pick up on the culture of an organization based on the language that leaders use, based on what team leaders talk about regularly, based on the mantras and the memes that exist within the organization. So I think communication professionals play an integral role in helping shape the language within an organization, which ultimately is going to help shape the culture.
Yeah. In the US, you're probably aware of some of the things that have been going on, in particular with DE&I. And so, I'd love to get your perspective on, because I think, those that are communications practitioners have been pretty central to some of the DE&I initiatives within organizations, especially within the US. But now we're seeing this becoming a much more kind of thorny topic. I just would love to get your thoughts on, the shift of a lot of organizations, and now we're seeing this, and how you think that might play out.
Yeah, it's a really tricky question to answer. And I think especially, I just want to acknowledge that I'm a 37-year-old white man with a very privileged life. And so just to speak into DE&I is a very interesting kind of conversation for me to have. However, what I do know, if we talk about it at a much broader level, anytime you see an environment that is driven by compliance rather than cultural leadership, the moment the compliance gets taken away or lifted, you see this strange snapback. Because I think in every organization, you have organizational memory. And if it's all about compliance and getting people to comply, then the organizational memory doesn't start to change. And it takes time for that to change. So I think where we're in an interesting place here at the moment is that when you start to see people removing what was essentially a moment of kind of compliance, you will start to see some things snap back very quickly. And I'm actually a little bit concerned about that. However, I think there's also a really incredible opportunity here for organizations to look at this at a cultural level, which is how do we shift beliefs, behaviors, values, understandings, and meanings towards the culture that we're aspiring to create. And I think the emphasis on culture is becoming more important now than ever before.
Yeah. And just in terms of generations too, so I've seen a lot of research come out about Gen Z, and whether it's, designing the workplace for Gen Z, and certainly some of the research that we're going to be doing, IBC is doing with USC Annenberg later in the year, will be focused on Gen Z. But I'd just love to get your perspective on, generational differences. What are some of the things that are happening within culture as a result of the multiple generations in the workforce, and Gen Z, which will, I think, in a few years will make up a couple of years will make up a third of the workforce.
Yeah. Gen Z is an interesting one, because I actually did just at the end of last year a small research project. We studied 1,000 kind of employees in America and looked at the generational differences when it came to culture. And there's a few things that stood out to me, but one of the things that was quite surprising to me is kind of how we tend to project certain expectations onto different generations. So one of the things that, if you were to ask me, what do you think is really important to Gen Z in the workplace? If you were to talk about culture, they would say, well, I think flexibility and remote work options are the most important thing to Gen Z. Interestingly enough, it was number 3 for them. It wasn't number 1. It was number 1 for Gen X and Gen Y. And I think it was further down the list for boomers. And I thought to myself, that's really strange. I assumed, based on the narrative that I had heard, that remote work was really important to Gen Z. And what was number 1 most important was trusting relationships. They wanted to actually trust their leadership. And the second was strong communication and feedback. And it was number 3 was flexibility and remote work. And as I dove deeper into the research, what I found that when we asked the question, what's kind of important to you in terms of work-life balance, 80% of Gen Z said work-life balance is the most important thing to them. So what we learned from that was that it wasn't necessarily that Gen Z want to work remotely or that they want to work from home. It's that they want to have good work-life balance. And so even when we went into more of the qualitative research, we found a lot of Gen Z saying to us, I actually really want to work in an office. I just don't want the office to dominate my entire life. So I think there is often some projections that we make based on generations about what they expect, what they want. And I'm a huge advocate that rather than trying to assume what people expect or assume what people want, the best thing we can do is have a conversation with them and ask, hey, what do you expect of work? Or what do you expect of us as an organization? And how do we build culture that springs out of that conversation around expectations?
Yeah. And for those that are, leadership roles, manager roles, what do you have recommendations for them and how they're working with Gen Z? So if you're a Gen Xer or, millennial, any advice or counsel?
Yeah, there's one of my favorite quotes is from a New York psychologist. Her name's Toria Leto. And she said, what isn't communicated is felt. What's felt is interpreted, and what is interpreted is often inaccurate. Okay. And so I think if you're a manager working with generational people on your team, you can, again, try to just assume you know what they want. But the best thing you can do is sit down and actually very explicitly ask, what do you expect of us on this team? And then how do we find what is going to be most useful for the way that we work together? It's maybe a silly example, but years ago, I remember McDonald's brought out this kind of make your own, customize your own menu. And ultimately, every single person can go in and design the burger that they wanted and design the meal that they wanted. And that seems like a very customized way of doing things. But when you look at the menu, there's only a set number of things on the menu that you could choose from. So it actually didn't impact them all to be able to provide customization for their menu. It didn't change the pricing model, didn't change anything. It just allowed people to feel that sense of autonomy. And often when people think about customizing the employee experience for people, they think, oh, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be challenging, it's going to create all this unnecessary work. And the truth is, you can create the feeling of customization or individualization for your employees by having a personalized conversation saying, what do we expect of one another? And then finding the ways that you can help, I guess, create a more customized environment for them without it actually taking a lot of extra effort or time or money.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to something that's I'm sure you've read and gone over is the Edelman Trust Barometer, which was pretty grim in some respects. Trust in a Crisis of Grievance, I believe is the title. But there was a report that 61% of those surveyed held grievances against government, business, and the wealthy. What do you think this means for organizational leaders and those that are in the communication field and practitioners? And is this what's the wake up call for what does it mean to you?
What's interesting? When you hear stats like that, you immediately think to yourself, well, obviously, of course, trust is important to an organization. And yet regularly we're hearing this coming up from people saying, hey, the most important thing for us is trusting relationships, especially, I was just saying before, Gen Z. The number one thing that they believe was the most important part of culture for them was trusting relationships, both with their peers and with their leaders. In our original survey, we asked people, what are the culture killers? What are the culture builders? And the number one culture killer was a lack of trust. So it's not surprising to me that this is coming out. It's surprising to me that we're not doing more intentionally around how we can build trust in organizations, because most people would talk about they want to have more influence in leadership, but we know you can't have influence without the foundation of trust. So I would really hope that it's a wake-up call for leaders to recognize that it's not just about what you have to say, but who you are as a leader as well. I use another silly example that I would say to someone, imagine someone showed up to your door today and they knocked on your door and said, hey, come jump in my car. I'd love to take you for a drive. Nobody is getting in the car with that person, right? And I say, well, what if I told you they're taking you somewhere you really want to go? Maybe it's your favorite travel destination. And what if they're a really, really good driver? What if they've got a really good experience or a really nice car? And everyone say, well, no, I don't care. I don't care how good you are at driving. I don't care where you're taking me. I don't trust you enough to get in the car. And yet when we talk to leaders about, especially in the area of communication, they think, oh, if my message is really good, then people will want to follow me. If my delivery is really great, then people will want to follow me. Or even if we point to the direction that's somewhere that they want to go, of course they'll want to go. And yet they don't, because they don't want to get in the car with you in the first place. So I think trust is this fundamental conversation we need to keep coming back to.
And I guess if you were speaking to a CEO right now, I mean, what would your advice be to sort of build that back in particular, or certain things that you would be able to do with, granted, it'd probably take, it's not just an endeavor that takes a couple months, but I mean, something that, over time, and, what would be your advice?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and trust is one of those things that can take a lifetime to build and a moment to undo.
Yeah.
But I think if you were to imagine that the almost like 4 quadrants of a model, there are things that you can do and take responsibility for as a leader, and there are the kind of reflection of how that shows up for other people. And I think the things that you are responsible for as a leader is, number one, I'm going to use the word character, but you could use the word authenticity or personality, whatever you kind of want to put in there. I use the word character, which is the thing that you see that nobody else sees, which is, are you as a leader ultimately in a good place? Because we know that when you're in a good place, the communication and the behavior that flows out from you is actually a lot more healthy and productive. So are you in a good place? And the second is the narrative that you lead, which is the stories that you, A, tell yourself about yourself, but B, also the stories that you show up and tell about yourself in the workplace. So I was working with a leader once and I said, how do you want to be known? How do you want to be perceived? And he said, well, I want to be known as someone who is decisive. And I said, well, are you a decisive person? Is that part of your character and your personality? He said, oh, no, definitely not. And I was like, well, we've got an issue here. Something needs to change. Either your behavior needs to change or your narrative needs to change. And I said, what is it about being decisive? He said, look, I think when I have to make decisions, I want to make sure I make the right decision. And so it sometimes takes me a bit longer. And I said, it sounds to me like you're being thorough. He said, yes, that's what I am. And I said, great. So rather than trying to lead a narrative that says I'm decisive, start to change your narrative and say I'm thorough. So when people came to him and said, look, we need a quick decision, he would say, look, I'm going to give you the fast decision that I can make, but I want to make sure I'm making a thorough decision. So ultimately, he wasn't being someone who was being seen as someone who was untrustworthy because he would say one thing and do another. He was showing up and his narrative was very aligned with his character. And I think if you get those right, reputation and credibility are the reflections of narrative and character.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know I mentioned earlier with sort of the return hybrid office and impact on culture, but what are your thoughts on the trend of, return to office 5 days in the week? I think, in US-based companies like Amazon and JP Morgan, 5 days in person. But do you think what impact do you think this will have and, the trust within organizations, or will it have any effect really? I mean, I guess, it's probably different across the board, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you see what I would consider to be very successful organizations on either end of this spectrum, right? So you've got people who are, mandating 5 days in the office, and you've got other people like Spotify who are saying, we're going to treat people like adults and they can work wherever they want. And I think both are creating a culture within their organization. When I reflect on this, most of this comes back to touching on what I said a little bit earlier on. The moment we create compliance for people, we create this, we're ultimately just creating compliance. So if we mandate things, then we create compliance. If we create culture shifts and culture change, or we put it through the lens of culture or cultural leadership, then we start to see behavioral change over time. I'm not one to say that you should be in the office or you should be at home. I think that ultimately comes down to the culture that you want to create within your organization and making sure that if you do mandate people to be in the office, there's not just a because I said so reasoning behind this, but rather you take people on that journey, which I think is an incredible reason why communication professionals play an important role in this. They can help shape the narrative of why they want people in the office and make sure that that language is creating cultural shift, not just a compliance shift.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Shane. I really appreciate your time. And we have one last question for you that we ask many of our folks that have come on PodCatalyst, but what gets you up in the morning?
The thing that gets me out of bed every single morning is the opportunity to watch a person get that light bulb moment where something shifts and they learn something new. And in the process of doing that, hopefully I learn something new as well. So I'm a lifelong learner. And so I think the opportunity to learn every day is what gets me out of bed.
Yeah, awesome. Well, again, looking forward to seeing you in Vancouver. And I know you've got a lot of travel ahead of you, so safe travels. And
thank you.
It was awesome to speak with you and see you again.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to World Conference. It's honestly the highlight of my calendar. I'm there every year. And so looking forward to seeing people from all over the world.
Thanks for listening to PodCatalyst, the official podcast of IABC. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Have a suggestion for a future episode? Send us a note at catalyst@iabc.com. To discover all IABC has to offer, visit our website at iabc.com. Until next time.